To the call of the chair pursuant to Clause 2 of House Rule 11, and without objection, the chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays are ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon and welcome to the first official meeting of the Natural Resources Committee for the 119th Congress. In the House chamber above the Speaker's rostrum is a quote by the 19th century American statesman Daniel Webster that says, "Let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, and promote all its great interests to see whether or not we also in our day and generation might do something worthy to be remembered." And I think that's exactly the task we as the Natural Resources Committee have before us during this Congress. If we wisely steward our nation's lands, waters, wildlife, minerals, and numerous other natural resources, they will be the source of our nation's prosperity today and for future generations. The devastating effects of the Palisades Fire, the Eaton Fire, and countless other wildfires and natural disasters that came before them make painfully clear that for far too long our natural resources have been mismanaged, degraded, and allowed to become liabilities rather than the assets for our nation that they should be. It is this committee's responsibility to change that course. We must increase access to our public lands and natural resources, managing them well, facilitating economic development for local communities, and expanding recreational opportunities for all Americans. And we did some of that in the last Congress, and we did it in a bipartisan manner, and I think we can do a lot of these goals in a bipartisan manner this year. Restrictive land use policies, I think, neglect and are a substitute for true conservation, and we need to harness, not hinder, our nation's abundant lands and waters. We must unlock our nation's energy and mineral resources to produce what we need and what the world needs here at home. As the country with the highest labor and environmental standards and the global leader in energy production, there's no reason why the United States should seek out energy resources from adversarial nations. We need to tackle the systemic issues caused by drought and promote resilience in the West. When left unaddressed, droughts drive food prices sky high, undermine family farmers' livelihoods, and contribute to catastrophic wildfires. Finally, we have a responsibility to work closely with tribal and insular communities to promote economic opportunities, improve public safety, and ensure they have the resources to thrive. I've been on this committee my entire time in Congress, and it's an honor to serve as chairman in the 119th Congress. I'd like to congratulate Mr. Huffman on assuming the role of ranking member of this committee. I look forward to working with each and every one of you this Congress. You'll find some of the most talented folks in Congress on this committee, each of whom brings a unique perspective and skill set to the table. Their districts range from urban to rural, east to west, but we all have one thing in common, and that's prioritizing the incredible resources with which America has been blessed. I do not doubt that we'll have more than our share of spirited debates, especially with Mr. Huffman sitting this close to me, but I'm hopeful we can work together to advance legislation that, in the words of Daniel Webster, is something that's worthy to be remembered. But before we can get into the legislative issues we're all excited to tackle, we first must organize and take care of committee business. I'm looking forward to adopting our committee rules today and getting to work on many important issues our constituents elected us to consider. I'll now recognize Ranking Member Huffman for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you. It is good to be back with you. Congratulations to all the new members on both sides of the aisle. On behalf of the Democratic members of this committee, I'd like to thank the majority for working with us to schedule this organizing meeting and for agreeing to continue on with the usual committee practices and norms that have been part of this committee in the past. As many of you know, this is my first time serving as the top Democrat on this committee, and I want you to know that holding that position has been an aspiration and a dream of mine for a long time, way before I came to Congress. It has been inspired by some remarkable champions for our country's natural resources who have served in this position before me, people from all over the country, but also including some Californians, the great George Miller. And there was another Californian by the name of Phil Burton, a bit of a legend in the San Francisco Bay Area, who was the ranking member and chair of this committee back in the 70s and 80s, and actually parlayed that position into coming within one vote of being Speaker of the House. He lost to a guy named Tip O'Neill. And I want you to know that I have no such ambitions or delusions, but I do very much look forward to building on the good work of those who came before us on this committee. Over the past 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, we've made historic progress in combating climate change, in lifting up indigenous voices, protecting iconic species, promoting environmental justice, and safeguarding our treasured places for future generations. We've passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included $370 billion in funding to fight climate change, the country's most meaningful investment in climate action ever. We protected some of the planet's most pristine resources from fossil fuel extraction. We successfully pushed back against Republicans' many attempts to dismantle environmental protections and sell off our natural resources. And now we are facing a new chapter, one that I worry will threaten and imperil the natural resources that we've been entrusted to protect on this committee and the people and the wildlife that depend on them. In just the first few hours of the second Trump presidency, under full Republican control of Washington, we have seen an avalanche of sweeping executive orders to undermine climate action, environmental justice, protections for clean air and water, and long-standing civil rights protections. And that just scratches the surface of what is sure to be in store for us in this Congress. But I want to thank our Republican friends for previewing a lot of this by publishing Project 2025. You don't have to look back much further than the last Congress, where we began to see much of this agenda rolling forward, laying the groundwork for President Trump's drill, baby drill agenda, and rolling back, attempting to roll back in the last Congress, many of the same protections that people in this committee decades ago fought to enact, back when we had so many great Republican champions of conservation and public land protection and other environmental values. You know, to put a finer point on it, I think it's safe to say that we're going to see some of these tried and true antics by the majority in the weeks and months ahead. We're going to see them denying the reality of climate change, stripping out every mention of it wherever possible. They're going to claw back the game-changing investments that we've made in clean energy and climate resiliency in return for handouts to their billionaire friends. We're going to see them jam through policies that are no more than a wolf in sheep's clothing so they can sacrifice our public lands and waters to the altar of big oil. And they're going to scapegoat bedrock environmental laws at every turn, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, and so forth, in order to gut protections and community input to further advance the special interest agenda. That is a pretty grim picture for what's ahead. I hope I'm wrong, but my experience here has taught me that that is likely what we are going to be facing. I do hold out hope for opportunities for bipartisanship if the majority is willing to work with us. In my 12 years in this committee, I've found space to carve out that work with my colleagues across the aisle, and I believe we can do it again, because at the end of the day, we have to govern. That said, Democrats will be focused on standing up for all families and working people, including indigenous communities and the U.S. insular areas. We'll be working every day to push back against the GOP's extreme pro-polluter agenda, because our goal is to tackle the urgent challenges of our time by moving forward real solutions to fight the climate crisis, advance environmental justice, and protect our natural resources for future generations. Doing that is a sacred trust, an intergenerational trust that we take very seriously. So I look forward to the coming Congress. Again, congratulations, everyone. I look forward to serving and working with you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce the new members on the Republican side of the dais. Some of them are new to the committee, but certainly not new to Congress. We'll start with Representative Mark Amadei, representing Nevada's 2nd Congressional District. I think this is your second tour on the Natural Resources Committee, and look forward to all you'll bring to the committee. From Michigan's 5th Congressional District, Tim Walberg, who's also the chairman of the House Education and Workforce Committee. Welcome you to the committee, Tim. And then also Mike Ezell from Mississippi's 4th Congressional District. member that's got a lot of expertise and knowledge on the Gulf Coast. We lost two of our former Gulf Coast members, and welcome you to the committee, Mike. From Utah's 2nd Congressional District, Celeste McCoy. Malloy, why do I always say McCoy? We're welcome you and glad to have you on the committee and know how important these issues are to the state of Utah. Then from North Carolina's 6th Congressional District, Addison McDowell, starting with these are our new freshmen in this Congress, and look forward to working with you, Addison. From Colorado's 5th Congressional District, we've got Jeff Crank, and next to him from Alaska's 1st Congressional District and only Congressional District, Nick Begich. Then Jeff Hurd is not here, but he represents Colorado's 3rd Congressional District. And finally, certainly last but not least, another Utahn from Utah's 3rd Congressional District, Mike Kennedy. So welcome to all of our new members. And I'll now recognize Mr. Huffman. I left a part out. We have 20, our members represent 20 different states and territories, each with its own unique resources and priorities. And again, I believe we have an unchosen obligation to be good stewards of these resources. And now I recognize Mr. Huffman to recognize their new members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some fantastic new members that I am honored to introduce to you, starting with Jared Golden from Maine. We have Dave Min from Southern California, the 47th Congressional District. Maxine Dexter from Oregon's 3rd District. Pablo Jose Hernandez Rivera from Puerto Rico. Emily Randall from Washington's 6th District. Yasamin Ansari from Arizona's 3rd District. Sarah Elfrith from Maryland's 3rd District. Adam Gray from California's 13th District. And Luz Rivas from California's 29th District. We also have rejoining us after a bit of time off the committee, veterans Darren Soto and Julia Brownlee. So great to be part of this team on the Democratic side of the aisle, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Now I want to recognize the leadership on the Republican side, and it's my pleasure to recognize the designation of Congressman Rob Whitman as the Vice Chairman of the committee. Rob, we appreciate your willingness to serve in this position. I know you've got leadership positions on other committees, but you certainly, it's obvious you've been here a while by the seniority you have on the committee. On our energy and mineral resources, we have returning Chairman Pete Stauber and then Vice Chairman Nick Begich. Their states obviously have vast untapped energy and mineral potential, and I know they will be champions of responsible development. On federal lands, we have Chairman Tom Tiffany returning, except he's not here right now, and Vice Chairman Mike Kennedy, with broad jurisdiction over everything from forestry to national parks. These guys will be leaders in expanding access to the lands we cherish. On Indian and Insular Affairs, we have Chairman Jeff Hurd, who is, again, not with us right now, and Vice Chair Amata Radawagan. Both of them have valuable insight into the unique challenges that tribal and insular communities face, and I know they will champion a path forward. On oversight and investigations, we've got returning Chairman Paul Gosar and Vice Chair Lauren Boebert. We appreciate the work that you all will do and the leadership on that committee. Then on water, wildlife, and fisheries, Harriet Hageman is moving into the role as chairman of that committee, and Mike Ezell will be the vice chairman. This subcommittee is immensely important in addressing issues ranging from western drought to wildlife management, and I believe the leadership that these folks will play in this role will be pivotal in finding solutions that work for all Americans. Clearly, there is no shortage of work to be done here on the Natural Resources Committee, and I'm honored to lead a fantastic group of men and women who care about these issues and are passionate about bringing wins home to their district. And I will say, on both sides of the aisle, you were able to get wins for your district with bipartisan bills that we passed out of the committee that ended up getting signed into law by the Senate. And we got a lot of bills out of this committee and on the floor, even if they didn't get passed by the Senate and signed into law. I want to recognize again Ranking Member Huffman to introduce his Vice Ranking Member and Subcommittee Ranking Members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to the Republican chairs of subcommittees. I assume that Chair Westerman has told you about the longstanding tradition of if you have good fishing spots in your district, you're supposed to ask the ranking Democrat to visit for a fact-finding tour. So we hope to experience that. But we have a fantastic lineup of leadership on the Democratic side that I will introduce to you now. Our new vice-ranking member of the full committee is Sarah Elfrith of Maryland. No stranger to anyone here, especially all the Coloradans on this committee, but our ranking member of the Federal Land Subcommittee will be Joe Neguse. And also coming back for another tour of duty at the Indian and Insular Affairs Subcommittee is Teresa Leger Fernandez. We're pleased to have a new ranking member at the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, Dr. Maxine Dexter. And Val Hoyle is stepping over to fill some small shoes as the ranking member at the Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Subcommittee. And finally, Yasamin Ansari is going to be stepping in as the ranking member at the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee. So a great team of ranking members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman, and congratulations and welcome to all the ranking members and leaders on the Democrat side of the dais. The next item of business is a consideration of the proposed committee rules. Copies of the rules were circulated to members' offices last week. Without objection, the proposed rules will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purposes of debate on the proposed rules? Ms. Stansberry, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to propose an amendment to the rules.
Well, we're debating the rules. We haven't.
Okay.
We'll get to the amendments in just a moment.
Great.
So I would like to.
Mr. Huffman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it should be no surprise that I will be opposing these rules since they dramatically favor the majority over those of us on my side of the dais. That said, I want to start with some positive comments. First, it was nice to see language formalizing our long-standing use of electronic voting. That's these gizmos that I believe it was Chairman Bishop first brought into practice. That is a good use of our time. I think all of us who have been on this committee should declare victory and celebrate that the other committees will finally be joining us in the modern world soon. These guys have found their way into the Transportation Infrastructure Committee now, and some others as well. So Chairman Bishop's legacy is impressive. I also want to acknowledge that you've proposed keeping the subcommittee issue areas the same as the last Congress. It is probably not how Democrats would organize things if we were in the majority, but it provides some continuity, which we can appreciate. And on that point, I want to acknowledge that, in fact, across the board, these rules stop short of making any substantive changes from last time. There are things in here that we still don't like, as I'll be discussing shortly, but I do appreciate the Republicans not making things worse with any dramatic changes or picking any unnecessary fights. We'll have the necessary ones, but it's good to not have unnecessary ones. The lack of substantive changes cuts both ways, though. It would have been nice to see some engagement and negotiation with the minority, because I think there are changes that we could have worked out together to make these rules better. The last time Democrats had the majority, we provided the proposed rules to you weeks before the organizing meeting so that you could review and develop suggestions and discuss them with us. Unfortunately, you and your Congress and your conference were able to negotiate with Democrats on 10 rule changes that you requested. We would have appreciated more notice, but I'm glad we got to do that. Some of those changes, some of those requests we met in full, and we gave partial concessions on others. It was collegial and collaborative, and I am grateful for that. This time around, I came to you with several detailed suggestions and requests in writing, well in advance, and yet none of those have fully been addressed. The closest that these rules come is a new line in there saying that the chair will provide us all with notice of any subpoena that he issues, but only if doing so is practicable. That is not a real notice requirement and is not good enough. As I said at the start, I urge my Democratic colleagues to oppose these rules since they disempower the minority. Those disadvantages are across the board, but in a few moments, when we get to amendments, I will focus my opposition on two specific topics. With that, I urge members on my side of the aisle to vote against the rules as proposed. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the rules? It's now in order to consider amendments to the proposed committee rules. Are there any amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from New Mexico.
All right, well, welcome to the 119th Congress. It's wonderful to be here with all of you this morning, and congratulations both to Mr. Chairman and our ranking member, and to our newest members on both sides of the aisle. We welcome you to the Natural Resources Committee. Today, I would like to offer an amendment to the rules, and specifically to Rule Number 4, which is the hearing procedures for this committee. You have in front of you...
Gentlelady will suspend. We went out of order on the amendments, but as I recognize you, need to say that for the I'm going to recognize you for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Stansbury number 3 revised, and without objection, the amendment is considered read. Now you can go.
Would you prefer to go in the order of the amendments as listed?
This is fine.
Okay, all right. All right, so back to the matter at hand. Today, I am proposing an amendment to Rule Number 4, which is the hearing procedures of the committee. You have the amendment in front of you, which is marked Amendment Number 3. Now, the purpose of this amendment is very simple, very straightforward. It is intended to make the process by which we pass legislation or consider policy changes that might affect our tribal nations or our insular areas done in consultation and conference with the communities who are actually impacted by them. This is actually the basic procedure. It's required by executive order within the executive branch, but we have not within this committee held ourselves accountable with a similar rule. So I'm going to read the rule here. Rule 4 is amended by adding a new subsection H after the end of subsection G. The committee and its subcommittees shall consult with any tribal nation and confer with any tribal and or insular entity on any particular matter that would affect the nation or entity prior to taking action on that matter. Now, the purpose of this rule change, as I said, is to require consultation with our tribal nations. This is already federal law pursuant to executive order within the executive branch. And because this committee has significant jurisdictional impacts on our insular areas, including, of course, Puerto Rico and our islands in the Pacific and the nations that we work with in partnership, we want to make sure that there is a formal process that governs the committee as we consider and take actions impacting these communities. Now, I find that this is a particularly timely and relevant amendment at this particular moment because only 2 days ago, when the current administration took office, our newly minted president introduced and signed an executive order to change the name of Mount Denali. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Mount Denali, and I know we have an Alaskan here on the committee, welcome, because this mountain is not only the highest peak in the continental United States and in Alaska, it is also a sacred mountain to the Alaska Native people who have called it home since time immemorial. And in fact, the former chairman of this committee, Representative Don Young, had carried legislation to change the name of Mount Denali back to Denali from Mount McKinley for many years. And in fact, the state of Alaska, even under GOP leadership, had petitioned the U.S. government to change Denali's name since 1975. So, for the incoming president to take unilateral action to change the name of this sacred mountain without consultation of the tribal nations that are impacted by them is something that we just simply cannot abide by. And certainly we want to hold this committee to account and make sure that as we enter this new policy era, that we are consulting with our tribes, our tribal nations, our tribal entities, and with our insular areas and friends across the world as we take decisions that will impact them. And with that, I stand for questions.
Young lady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I'll recognize myself.
Mr. Chair, sorry.
Are you asking?
Yeah, whenever.
I'll recognize you first.
Yeah, because you want to end, right?
Yeah.
The prerogative of the chair. I just want to raise my voice in support of this. The great thing is, in the Indian and Insular Affairs Committee, we always do have Native American representation on the bills. That's the whole purpose of the committee. And I think what this is looking for is what happens in the other committees to make sure that we do have that consultation, that we carry it forward. There's always been an executive order that recognizes that there is a trust responsibility to do this. So the federal agencies have for decades recognized the importance of having that tribal consultation when it matters. I think the Denali example would be a good one because that would probably fall under federal lands and not under Indian and Insular Affairs. So you would want to make sure you had that consultation in that kind of circumstance. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Young lady yields back. Is there further discussion? I'll recognize myself. I oppose this amendment because it's really unnecessary, it's duplicative, and I think the results of our work in the last Congress will highlight that. And personally, as chairman, I've been committed to a regular order process in the committee that allows for robust opportunities for input from members of Congress as well as tribal, state, and local officials and outside stakeholders alike. I want to go through some of the numbers here. Last Congress, we continued our efforts to highlight Native voices and work collaboratively with tribes and tribal organizations. We hosted over 50 tribal witnesses who testified across all our subcommittee jurisdictions. Each witness presented aspects of the multifaceted and complex opinions that tribes and individual Native Americans have within Indian country. Receiving information from tribal leaders about the challenges they face and the successes they've had highlights how important it is for Congress to work with tribes to find solutions to address the most pressing needs in tribal communities. And again, I'll say the work of this committee speaks for itself. For example, the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs held 16 tribally focused hearings in the 118th Congress. These hearings covered issues including public safety in Indian country, holding the Indian Health Services accountable, putting land into trust to benefit individual tribes, and improving burdensome bureaucratic policies that tribes and tribal members must navigate. Of the 23 tribal bills our Indian and Insular Affairs Subcommittee had hearings on, 6 individual bills that benefited tribes were signed into law last Congress. These were bills supported by this committee in a bipartisan manner. The committee has also done remarkable work with our insular territories. We held 10 insular hearings and invited 27 witnesses from the insular areas to present their views on legislation and oversight topics. The committee went so far as to hold a historic field hearing in Guam to learn firsthand about growing Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific, the key role Guam plays in our national defense, and the importance of the Compacts of Free Association, which I'm proud of the fact that we worked in a bipartisan manner to reauthorize COFA in the last Congress. We will continue working with our tribal and insular partners this Congress, and no change to the committee rules is required to allow this to happen. I oppose the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to oppose as well.
Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further discussion?
Would you yield, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield some time to the gentlelady from New Mexico, but first I just want to say that it's disappointing that our friends across the aisle that have a nice prepared list of all of the things that they can point to, saying that they take tribal interests and the respect for Indian country seriously, would reject a simple proposal that we include Native voices when we are taking actions like perhaps acting on the new president's insane idea to recolonialize and rename Denali. That's something that we should all quickly acknowledge is of special interest to Native Alaskans. They should be at the table. They should be advising us, informing us. And it seems like an easy ask to acknowledge that in our rules. So I'm disappointed to hear that, especially in the wake of just some dystopic rhetoric, including the inaugural speech, which romanticized Manifest Destiny without any discussion of all of the massacres of Native Americans that were part of that dark history. Seems like we should do better. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from New Mexico.
Well, I thank the ranking member especially for reminding us of the words that we heard actually in the halls of this Congress just a few days ago. I think in my time working in the federal government, I never expected that in the year 2025, we would hear a sitting U.S. president regale an era of colonialism, expansion, an era in which we intentionally as a nation invaded other countries and colonized their lands, and to speak so blatantly and openly about the taking of Native lands across the West, and then to take an executive action as one of their first actions, and to do it publicly in front of the American people without any regard for the Native voices who would be impacted from it, I think is truly shocking and chilling in the year 2025. So while I appreciate that there has been an effort by the chairman, and I do respect greatly the chairman and colleagues across the aisle who do make an effort to bring tribal leaders and voices into this committee, notwithstanding that and the list of excellent work that was done by this committee last Congress, there were multiple bills that went to the House floor for a vote that the tribal leaders of those communities who were impacted by them did not support. So there is a need to have formal consultation in the rules of this committee to hold ourselves accountable, and especially as we're entering an era in which we have a sitting president who is openly glorifying the taking of lands of islands and other countries and of indigenous communities. I think we need to hold ourselves to account and do better in this committee, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hageman, I think,
Yes, sir.
is first.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was the chairman of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs for the 118th Congress, and I take great pride in the fact of the work that we did on behalf of our tribes throughout the country, addressing everything from the issues associated with security and the Indian Health Services, economic development. Not only did we have numerous hearings addressing those issues throughout the entire 2-year period, but we also had a roundtable discussion, I believe, in September or October of last fall that lasted several hours, brought in tribal members again from around the country and focused specifically on the security, the economic development and challenges we have with the providing Indian health services. There is nothing that prevents us from bringing in tribal members for any hearing that we may have, whether it is of the committee as the whole, or it is the individual subcommittees such as water, wildlife, and fisheries. And in fact, I would assume that the committee chairs will be inviting a variety of tribal members to come and testify on those matters that are important to them, depending upon the issue at hand. I take offense at anyone who might imply that there is any sort of racism associated with it on this side of the aisle or the decisions that we are making. Again, I think that the work that we did last year on this subcommittee was stellar. I have developed incredible relationships with tribal members around the country addressing the challenges that they have, and I anticipate that just like with me, with everyone else on this committee, they will continue to reach out to us and participate in this process just as any other citizen of the United States would on those matters that are important to them. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Boebert, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to second the former chairwoman's comments, and we've always invited our tribal leaders and members here to the committee and have been open to these discussions. I served on the subcommittee in my first Congress, and I've worked closely with Chairman Baker and Chairman Hart. Chairman Baker with the Southern Utes in Colorado and Chairman Hart with the Ute Mountain Utes. And we have put forward some very good legislation that benefits our tribal lands. We've worked closely to mitigate the wolf situations in Colorado specifically. And even with the NCA that I put forward, that was something that our tribal leaders had been working on for about a little over a decade, and I did not receive any Democrat support there on that piece of legislation, but this was something that our tribal leaders spoke up and wanted Congress to move forward with, a bipartisan, really common sense position on conservation. And so I would say that this is duplicative, and this subcommittee would never reject the opinions of our tribal leaders or members. We enjoy working closely with them. We recognize their sovereignty, and we also recognize the need for energy independence here in America and how we can better deal with them in a fashion that also realizes the debt that we are facing, this cliff that we are about to jump off of, and then of course honor their requests and hear from them. So I appreciate the amendment that is offered to highlight the needs of our friends in our tribal lands, but I would also urge a no vote against this because we've always extended that invitation. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Stansberry, designated Stansberry number 3, revised. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I was disappointed, but not surprised to see that the Republican rules package once again blocks Democrats from ever picking witnesses who would be testifying remotely. Under these rules, only the chair gets to invite a witness who would appear remotely, and even then, it is only after obtaining approval from the majority leader, Steve Scalise. So in addition to being completely partisan, it is mystifying to me why you would do this. Is this just lingering distaste for anything that was a precaution during the COVID period? I am not coming at this from a public health perspective. It's about democracy. Now that we have these technologies, do we think that Congress should hear only from witnesses who are close enough to Washington, D.C. to hop over here on short notice, or from those who maybe can't get multiple days off work? What about those who can't get multiple days off work? What about those who can't afford a babysitter? What about those who can't afford an expensive lobbyist to speak on their behalf, much less a plane ticket and a Washington, D.C. hotel? What about witnesses who live in other parts of the world who would otherwise struggle to travel here? So our jurisdiction includes places like Guam, American Samoa, remote tribes, Alaska Native villages, Native Hawaiian communities. We should be hearing from those people in those locations, many of whom represent marginalized communities. I will also note that even before the pandemic, this committee had sometimes allowed witnesses to testify remotely, so this should not be a partisan issue. Now, when he was ranking member of the EMR subcommittee, our colleague, Mr. Gosar, requested and Democrats approved that a tribal witness be allowed to testify remotely. And that was before the House's pandemic-era policies, by the way. So my amendment would simply require the chair to request, it would require the chair to request the majority leader's approval for a remote witness requested by the minority in very specific circumstances. The witness would be from an insular area, for example, a tribe, a Native Alaskan community in Alaska, or Native Hawaiian community, if the witness would be testifying on an insular or indigenous topic, respectively, and that we provide written justification for those requests. That's not too much to ask. That last part, by the way, the written justification, is the paperwork that the chair has to submit to the majority leader. So we're even offering to fill out the permit application for you, if you can just work with us to make this happen in special circumstances. This is not complicated, it's not costly, or even precedent-breaking. It simply allows us to expand our witnesses beyond wealthy stakeholders and Beltway lobbyists, and to include the voices of underserved communities whose lives are impacted by a lot of the work we do on this committee. I ask my colleagues to choose to hear from all of the American people, and I urge adoption of this amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Neguse.
I thank the chairman. I would just underscore my support for the ranking member's amendment for all the reasons that he articulated. When I first joined this committee in 2019, as the ranking member articulated, there were practices in effect to enable the remote testimony for witnesses under certain circumstances. This was pre-pandemic, has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's all about ultimately ensuring that every American can participate in their government. And in particular, for members like myself who represent large rural districts, this particular provision is a salient one. I know we have many new members from Utah and Alaska and others, and we welcome you all, and of course, my newest colleagues from Colorado. And they will well understand that requiring a rancher in Jackson County in my district to expend great resources to come travel to Washington, D.C. to testify on a particularly simple or elementary bill regarding a land exchange, just by way of example, is unnecessary. And all we're asking for here is a little flexibility. Let's provide some level of flexibility within the rules that would require the assent of the majority, obviously, as well as the minority, to be able to ultimately have witnesses testify here remotely. I don't think it's a large ask, and I would think that it would be a prudent thing for this committee to consider. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? I recognize Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. And I think that, as I mentioned, what I love about serving on this committee and serving as first chair, when I first came in as chair of the the Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples, and now the Indian and Insular Affairs, is the range of voices that we absolutely must hear from. And I had the great benefit, by the way, Representative Begich, of having Don Young serve as the ranking member when I first came on, and he taught me so much. But many times, the people that I learned from were in Alaska and were in places that made it very difficult for them to get here. And I learned in my own trips to Alaska that there are no roads, right? That too often, and in the middle of winter, there aren't roads. It's not like you can get on a road and climb. It is hard to get here. And so what this is simply a request to make a request. It isn't mandatory. It's this: would you please ask if it were okay if people in Alaska, if people far away, Chair Westerman, I'm so grateful to you for having taken us to the Blue Continent to see the insular areas, because it takes so long to get there. Never did I realize how hard it was to get here from Guam and from those places. So there are places that are very, very far away. And I think recognizing that, having the kind of guardrails that are in the amendment, and just asking, would you please ask if it were all right, if they were able to participate. It's not all the time, because I do recognize it's always, I do like having that live body here and the interchange that we have. So it's only in those special circumstances. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Crank?
Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification, does anything in the current rules prohibit this remote testimony now?
No, and I will address that a little bit later.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Any further discussion on the issue? I'll recognize myself, and again, I oppose this amendment because, quite frankly, it's unnecessary. House rules already provide for remote witnesses. I can tell you, after suffering through COVID and all witnesses being remote, I'm a big fan of in-person witnesses. But however, there could be special circumstances where a request is made and the chair can approve a remote witness. The amendment would just require the chair to accept a remote witness if the requests were made by the ranking member. So we still have the opportunity to have remote witnesses if it's a circumstance where that's justified, but I think the committee's better served when we have witnesses in person, and if at all practicable, I would love to have the witnesses here in person. So therefore, I oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to oppose it as well. Is there further discussion? Ms. Hoyle, you're recognized.
Thank you to the gentlelady from Oregon. So I'm not hearing any great opposition across the aisle to special circumstances that may make it totally appropriate to allow remote testimony. But I'm hearing opposition to a rule that would simply give us a guarantee, an assurance, that if we come to you in one of those special circumstances and ask that you take this to Steve Scalise and ask for permission, that you'll do it. I think that's not asking much. But look, if what I'm hearing from you, Mr. Chairman, and from your colleagues across the aisle, is that the rules will allow you to do that as a courtesy and that you will extend that courtesy to Democrats, I would at least like you to put that on the record, to at least give us that assurance verbally now that if we come to you with compelling circumstances, that you will take that request to Steve Scalise and see if we can't work it out so we can hear from people in Samoa and other parts of the world that are going to have a hard time getting here on short notice.
If you're asking that in form of a colloquy, I'll just say that, elections have consequences, and as the majority, that would be giving away power of the majority to say that we're required to do something the minority asks us to do. Now, working in good faith, we will take those requests under consideration, but I still oppose your amendment. Is there?
We will put that good faith to the test, I'm sure, and I appreciate the exchange. I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification. Is there anything that would prohibit this committee from doing a field hearing for somebody if they're a necessary witness that could not get here?
Now, we do a lot of field hearings, but I don't think we would schedule a field hearing specifically because somebody couldn't come to Congress. But we do a lot of field hearings, and we're actually planning a tribal field hearing soon in the year. But yeah, the committee's known for doing a lot of field hearings.
Well, I would echo my opposition to this amendment as well, sir.
Does the gentleman yield? Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, thank you for the time. I think it's useful just to respond, and also for folks who are watching. Folks may not realize that when you're invited to come and testify in front of the committee, you have to pay for it at your own expense. And so the purpose of the amendment is to ensure that this committee is accessible to all Americans, no matter where you live, what your income status is, and especially for folks like myself, Congresswoman Ledger Fernandez, and those of us who come from rural and more remote areas. It's extremely challenging, financially challenging, geographically challenging for many of our leaders from our communities to come and testify in person. And while the committee rules do not prevent us from doing this, and I appreciate that, part of the purpose of having rules is to be clear on our intentions as a committee. If we could just do whatever we wanted because the rules didn't tell us we couldn't, then we don't even need rules. That's the whole point of having rules. So that's why we're offering the amendment, and I'm really glad you asked the question, because the whole point is to make sure that people who are affected by our decisions can participate. So thank you for yielding. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Randall, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I will recognize I'm very new to Congress, and I'm adjusting to the things that are different from my state legislature. I had the great honor of chairing the Higher Education and Workforce Development Committee in the Washington State Senate, and even before COVID, our committee piloted fully remote testimony. Because Washington State is certainly smaller than the country, but it is a big state that takes a long time for folks to travel from one corner to the other. And particularly for our Republican neighbors who lived in the more rural parts of Washington, what it meant was that we had more balanced and more accessible testimony for folks who couldn't take time off work, who had childcare needs, who wanted to be present at the request of the chair or as is allowed in Washington because they're interested in bringing their voice to the legislature. And I think it shaped committees that were more impactful for the people. And I completely respect your decision, Mr. Chairman. And yes, elections do have consequences, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how we are making the halls of power more accessible to the people we represent, and that's why I'll be voting yes to this amendment today. I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gosar, you're recognized.
Yeah, could anybody on the other side tell us one case that did not go through that was not asked for, please? Yes.
Thank you. Does the gentleman yield?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. Well, I had the joy and sometimes challenge, of course, of being the ranking member with you, Mr. Gosar.
Must have been a joy.
It was a joy. We had some good times. So, yeah, I mean, there were a number of cases where we invited minority witnesses, but due to financial or geographic hardships, they were not able to come and testify in front of the subcommittee. And I think this happens all the time, but it may fly under the radar and not rise to the level even that maybe the whole committee is aware of it. So it does impact our communities on a day-to-day basis, and certainly we want to make sure that our communities have the access. So I yield back.
Well, my question would be, to see that, but I think that the chairman has been and done everything in good faith. And I would love to kind of monitor this to see who and what can't come to here. I do understand the farthest reach because I've had almost all of rural Arizona at one time or another. So from that standpoint, I would like to see a reporting of why and who couldn't come. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? There's no further discussion. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Yeah, recorded vote. Please.
Recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 2. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my second and last amendment today. Under the proposed rules, the chair can issue subpoenas without a vote, in secret, without notifying the rest of us, even after the fact, notifying the rest of us. A subpoena can change a person's life profoundly, altering their careers, costing them tens of thousands of dollars or more in legal fees. Oversight is a critical function of this committee, but subpoenas need to be taken very seriously. There needs to be at least some measure of accountability. I'd like to remind my colleagues of some very recent historical context when it comes to our decisions around subpoena power. When Democrats had the majority, Chair Grijalva struck a deal with ranking member at the time, Mr. Bishop, about these unilateral subpoenas. Instead of allowing the Democratic chair to issue a subpoena with no restrictions, we agreed with Republicans that the minority would get 7 days' notice before a subpoena was issued, along with a written justification for the subpoena. We also agreed that members could veto the subpoena during that 7-day period if over half the members signed a letter requesting a meeting to vote on it instead. These guardrails provided members with transparency and a mechanism for accountability, something Democrats were happy to enact. When Mr. Westerman became ranking member, he continued Mr. Bishop's opposition to a fully unilateral chair's subpoena. At his request, Democrats once again agreed to the Bishop-Westerman guardrails. But even that wasn't enough to appease them. At the organizing meeting in the 117th Congress, then-ranking member Westerman was so concerned that he offered an amendment to give himself full veto power over Democratic subpoenas. No such subpoena could be issued without his sign-off. And in his remarks, he said, I quote, "As you know, subpoenas are a very powerful investigatory and oversight tool, and that's why the committee rules have historically required votes by the members of this committee before issuance of any subpoenas. Such a powerful tool warrants at least concurrence with the ranking member to prevent abuse of power and undue harm for the individual being subpoenaed." That was Mr. Westerman just a few years ago. He went on to say, and I'm still quoting here, "The rules as proposed today leave every one of our constituents vulnerable to the unchecked power of the chairman and potentially to all future chairmen of this committee," end quote. So you can imagine my surprise, Mr. Chair, when one of your first acts as chair was to scrap the minority safeguards that were negotiated with Mr. Bishop and yourself and to give unfettered subpoena authority to yourself. No 7-day notice, no chance for a committee member to show that a majority wishes to debate and vote on the matter, no requirement for a justification for the subpoena, not even a requirement that the chair inform members after the subpoena has gone out. I was less surprised to see the same in the proposed rules this time around. But I was still hopeful that we could at least negotiate some common sense guardrails. I asked for restoring the original guardrails, but Mr. Chair, you refused that. I asked for at least requiring notice to the minority, an actual requirement, not the language we have now, to the extent practicable, which is meaningless. In this era of modern communication technology, notice to the minority is easy. It's always going to be practicable, and yet we have rules that won't acknowledge that. My amendment would not take us all the way back to the original guardrails that Mr. Westerman and others have fought for. It doesn't demand that I have veto power over the chair's subpoenas. Instead, it just restores a proven bipartisan compromise, the same guardrails that were there for 3 years at the request of our Republican colleagues. The only way to prevent a subpoena from being issued under this amendment is if a majority of members on this committee request an opportunity to discuss it and vote on it. That shouldn't be controversial. If the committee doesn't support a subpoena, it shouldn't be issued. So I urge adoption of this amendment, these common sense, historically bipartisan guardrails, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Neguse.
Again, I want to reiterate my support for the ranking member's amendment, for all the arguments that he articulated. I remember well the debate that we had in the 117th Congress at the organizing meeting that the ranking member referenced. And I will say, and it pains me to say this because I have great respect for the chairman and I think the bipartisan manner in which he prides himself on, which is well-deserved. But with respect to this particular provision of the rules, as was vociferously argued years ago, this is not consistent with the way we do business in the House. And I recognize elections have consequences. A similar argument was made at the commencement of the 118th Congress. But understand that the precedent you are setting will govern long into the future. Majorities come, majorities go. For as long as anyone can remember, the fundamental rule was to enable basic safeguards, basic guardrails for the issuance of a subpoena, notice requirements, and consultation with the minority. That, in my view, is a reasonable approach. This committee decided to do something that most other committees in the House have not done, which is eliminate both of those guardrails. And I just will hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will recognize that the precedent they set now will govern into the future. And I will say, and insofar as the chairman's willing to perhaps engage in a colloquy on this point. It's unclear to me why this committee is being treated differently than other committees within the House. And I don't know if maybe the chairman has some thoughts on that or could provide some insight as to why the rule is different in this committee than other committees.
I will say the rule is proposed is consistent with the House rules. And I don't think this is an anomaly that our committee has the rule that we have.
I thank the chairman for that clarity. Many members of this committee serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. My friend Russ in Idaho and Mr. Stauber from Minnesota, they serve on E&C. E&C's rule, I'm reading it here, this is Rule 16, requires notice and requires consultation. The chair shall notify the ranking minority member prior to issuing any subpoena under such authority. To the extent practicable, the chair shall consult with the ranking minority member at least 72 hours in advance of a subpoena being issued. These are the rules that the Energy and Commerce Committee just promulgated a week ago. I understand Chairman Wahlberg is new to this committee, and we welcome him and look forward to working with him with respect to his principal committee of jurisdiction, the Education and Workforce Committee. His committee, Mr. Wahlberg, you promulgated rules last week that you pronounced. I found these on your website. Rule 10, subpoena authority. The chair shall notify the ranking member prior to issuing any subpoena under such authority. To the extent practicable, the chair shall consult with the ranking member at least 24 hours in advance of a subpoena being issued. I think that's a great rule. If it's good enough for Chairman Wahlberg's committee, if it's good enough for the Energy and Commerce Committee, if it's good enough for most of the committees in the House, I just don't understand why we don't adopt that basic notice and consultation language. It does not stop the chair from unilaterally issuing a subpoena. It simply creates a layer of consultation so that the minority can voice its opinion via the ranking member. And it's certainly something that, I mean, again, I'll applaud Chairman Wahlberg for his leadership in promulgating this as part of the rules on education and workforce and the other chairs that have decided to take this route. And I would just encourage Chairman that perhaps this committee do the same.
The gentleman yield.
Of course.
So just looking at the rules, D4 says for any subpoena issued pursuant to Committee Rule 4D1, the chair shall, to the extent practicable, cause notice of the issuance of such subpoena to the minority, and such notice shall be given at least contemporaneously with service of such subpoenas, which sounds remarkably like the language in the...
So the two distinctions, just to be very clear, the rules that I just described, which are consistent with at least all the other rules that I've found of other committees, require notice before the subpoena is issued. Number one, very clear, bright line rule, very different than the provision that's articulated here. Secondly, every other committee that I've found requires some level of consultation to the extent practicable. What you've done, or what the staff has done here, is conflated the two. So you've inserted a practical standard with respect to giving notice, not with respect to consultations. Basically, if it's practical, make sure you give notice at some point within a week after this subpoena being issued. In any event, I digress. I know we've had this debate previously, but I would just hope for some of our newer members, the contextually understanding, you're going to be here a long time, and I trust, and I suspect this debate will rage on into the future, and I would hope that this is not the precedent that governs. So,
Gentlemen's time's expired. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I do oppose this amendment, although it's being offered under the auspices of guardrails. Really, what this amendment would ultimately be used for is a delay tactic to impede oversight by the committee. In certain circumstances, mechanisms already exist to ensure notice to the ranking member before acting under the color of subpoena authority. For example, if a subpoena is to compel witness testimony at a hearing before the committee, House and committee rules already require a 7-day notice of such a hearing. To the extent a subpoena is used to effectuate a deposition, the regulations for the use of deposition authority require consultation with the ranking minority member and 3 days' notice specifying the date, time, and place of examination. Also read the rule about a reasonable requirement that the majority notify the minority. And also, if adopted, the amendment would serve the sole purpose of frustrating the committee's oversight obligations, which I don't think we can can jeopardize that. So again, I oppose the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 2. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment will be postponed. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and we will start voting at 3:30. Members will record their votes using the electronic voting system. The question is on the amendment designated Stansbury number 3 revised, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote.
The first vote's always sticky.
Yeah,
It
you
takes
have
a
to
while.
push the button a few times to get it warmed up.
This is one of my favorite things about this country, besides you, Mr. Chair.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 20.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment designated Huffman number 1, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote.
We gained seats in the election, but lost. It had to do with reconfiguring a couple other committees.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 20.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment designated Huffman number 2, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 21.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the adoption of the committee rules. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the rules are adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The next order of business is consideration of the committee resolution to appoint Republican and Democrat committee staff under House rules. The resolution was circulated with a meeting notice. Without objection, the committee staff is appointed. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the documents the committee just adopted, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.